Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As I stand before you today, I find myself compelled to delve into a topic that resonates deeply within the human experience, the allure of temptation and the seductive whispers of the devil. This is not merely an abstract discussion about good versus evil. It strikes at the very core of who we are as men. In our pursuit of success, power, and pleasure, we often unwittingly invite the devil into our lives, allowing his influence to shape our choices and cloud our judgment. Today, I want to explore 7 specific traits that the devil finds particularly enticing in men, traits that, if left unchecked, can lead us down a path of ruin. Now, you may wonder why I, a humble servant of the church, would choose to speak on such a subject. It is because I have witnessed firsthand the devastation that unchecked vices can bring to individuals, families, and entire communities. The devil does not announce his arrival with thunder and lightning. He creeps in through subtlety, exploiting our weaknesses and feeding our desires until they consume us. He does not force us to sin. He merely presents temptation in a way that seems appealing, even justified, and men in particular are vulnerable to his schemes, for the devil knows precisely which buttons to press. This is not a lecture meant to frighten or condemn, rather, it is a call to self-awareness. By understanding the very things that the devil loves about men, we can begin to recognize his influence in our own lives. We can see how pride, lust, anger, greed, sloth, and deception are not merely moral failings, but tools in the devil's arsenal, tools that he wields with precision. But knowledge is power, and by shedding light on these temptations, we equip ourselves with the wisdom needed to resist them. As we proceed, I will not simply list these 7 things and move on. No, I intend to delve deep, to provide real-world examples that illustrate their dangers. I will speak plainly as a pastor who has walked alongside men in their struggles, and I will challenge you to examine your own heart. The devil may love these things about men, but we do not have to give him the satisfaction. Let us begin with the first and perhaps most insidious of these temptations, pride. Let me begin by asking you a question. What is pride? At its core, pride is an exaggerated sense of self-worth, an unwavering belief that one is superior to others. It is not merely confidence, it is arrogance. And it is precisely this arrogance that the devil adores in men, for it blinds them to their own flaws and makes them susceptible to his influence. Pride convinces men that they are above reproach, that they do not need guidance, and that they alone are the masters of their fate. It is the first sin of the original rebellion that cast Lucifer from heaven, and it remains his most potent weapon against us today. Consider the man who believes himself invincible, who refuses to admit when he is wrong. He dismisses criticism, ignores advice, and pushes away those who seek to help him. He sees no need for humility because he is convinced of his own brilliance. But pride does not merely isolate, it distorts reality. It makes men believe they can outweigh consequences, that they can bend the rules without facing repercussions. And so they make reckless decisions, take unnecessary risks, and ultimately fall into ruin. History is filled with examples of pride's destructive power. Take, for instance, Napoleon Bonaparte. One of history's most brilliant military minds, his strategic genius led him to conquer much of Europe, but his insatiable ambition and refusal to accept defeat led to his downfall. He believed himself destined for greatness beyond mortal limits, and in his arrogance, he marched into Russia with an army of 500,000 men, only to see it decimated by winter and starvation. His pride blinded him to the wisdom of retreat, and as a result, he lost everything. And yet, pride is not confined to the pages of history. It is alive and well in our modern world, manifesting in ways both grand and subtle. Consider the man who rises to a position of power and begins to believe that he alone is responsible for his success. He forgets the sacrifices of his mentors, the support of his family, and the opportunities granted by fate. He begins to see himself as untouchable, and in doing so, he alienates those who once stood beside him. He grows cold, distant, and unyielding, convinced that he has nothing left to learn. But pride does not only affect the powerful, it affects men from all walks of life. It is the young man who believes he knows better than his parents, the husband who refuses to apologize for his mistakes, the father who puts his own ambitions before the needs of his children. Pride convinces men that they can handle anything alone, that they do not need God, that they do not need anyone, and in that isolation they become vulnerable to the devil's whispers. You see, pride is not just a personal failing, it is a spiritual trap. It separates us from one another and from the divine. When we elevate ourselves above others, we close ourselves off from grace. We become deaf to the wisdom of humility, blind to the need for repentance, and numb to the cries of those who suffer. And in that state, we are easy prey for the devil, who delights in watching us stumble under the weight of our own ego. So I ask you, where do you see pride in your own life? Do you cling to your own opinions, unwilling to listen to others? Do you refuse to admit fault, even when you know you are wrong? Do you place your own desires above the well-being of those around you? If so, then you are walking a dangerous path, one that the devil eagerly paved for you. But there is hope. There is always hope. For humility is the antidote to pride, and by embracing it, we free ourselves from the devil's grip. If pride is the first sin, then lust is among the most persistent. It is a fire that burns not only in the heart, but in the very fabric of society. The devil knows this well, for he understands that lust is not merely a matter of physical desire. It is a force that can erode the foundations of relationships, compromise moral integrity, and lead men astray in ways that extend far beyond the bedroom. Lust distorts the way men view love, intimacy, and commitment, transforming something sacred into something selfish. It convinces men that gratification is more important than loyalty, that impulse is more valuable than restraint, and that fleeting pleasure outweighs enduring joy. Let us not mistake lust for passion or affection, for they are not the same. Passion is a flame that warms, a force that deepens bonds and strengthens marriages. Lust, on the other hand, is a wildfire that consumes without regard for what it leaves behind. It is the man who, in the name of desire, betrays his wife. It is the man who seeks validation through conquest, treating women as objects rather than people. It is the man who becomes addicted to pornography, allowing fantasy to replace reality. And in each case, the consequences are devastating, not only for the men themselves, but for those they hurt along the way. We need only look to the stories of history to see how lust has undone even the greatest of men. Consider the tale of King David, a man after God's own heart, who fell into sin not through violence or greed, but through lust. He saw Bathsheba from atop his palace, and rather than turning away, allowed his desires to dictate his actions. He took her for himself, committed adultery, and then, in a desperate attempt to cover his sin, orchestrated the death of her husband. What began as a moment of weakness led to a cascade of destruction. His family was torn apart, his kingdom suffered, and his soul bore the weight of guilt. And yet history repeats itself, for lust remains a formidable adversary. In our own time, we see its effects in the rise of infidelity, in the breakdown of marriages, and in the way men are increasingly conditioned to view intimacy as a transaction rather than a bond. The devil does not need to force man into sin. He merely needs to whisper that no one will know, that no harm will come of it, that they deserve indulgence. And so men fall believing they are in control, when in truth they are enslaved by their own desires. But the consequences of lust are not limited to personal relationships. They ripple outward, shaping culture, influencing the way we view one another, and distorting our understanding of love itself. When lust becomes the standard, respect diminishes, and people are reduced to means of gratification rather than ends. In that erosion of respect, the devil rejoices, for he knows that when men lose sight of true love, they lose something far greater than pleasure. They lose their humanity. Anger is a force that, when left unchecked, can consume a man's soul and leave destruction in its wake. It is not merely an emotion. It is a weapon, one that the devil wields with precision to turn men against one another, against themselves, and even against God. The devil does not fear anger. He encourages it, for he knows that beneath its fiery surface lies the potential for ruin. He does not need to create anger. He only needs to fan its flames, to stoke the embers of resentment until they erupt into uncontrollable rage. Consider the man who allows his anger to dictate his actions. He lashes out at those closest to him, destroying relationships that took years to build. He sees enemies where there are none, interpreting every slight as an affront, every disagreement as a personal attack. He holds grudges, nursing his bitterness like a precious treasure, convinced that his anger is justified, and in his fury, he becomes blind to reason, deaf to wisdom, and numb to the consequences of his actions. History is littered with examples of men whose anger led to their downfall. Take, for instance, the biblical figure of Samson, a man of immense strength. He was blessed by God with the power to overcome his enemies. Yet, despite his gift, he was a man ruled by his emotions, quick to anger and slow to temper himself. His wrath led him to make reckless decisions, to seek vengeance rather than peace, and ultimately to his own destruction. His final act, bringing down the temple upon himself and his enemies, was not a moment of triumph but of tragedy, a testament to the cost of uncontrolled fury. But anger is not confined to ancient stories. It is alive and well in our modern world, manifesting in ways both large and small. We see it in the man who cannot tolerate criticism, who responds to the slightest disagreement with hostility. We see it in the father who lashes out at his children, in the husband who cannot control his temper, in the man who lets road rage escalate into violence. And we see it in the broader world, in wars fought over wounded pride, in communities torn apart by hatred, in the way men are often taught that anger is the only acceptable form of strength. The devil delights in this, for he understands that anger, when left to fester, gives birth to violence. It is not enough for a man to feel anger. He must act on it, must justify it, must convince himself that his rage is righteous. And in that conviction, he becomes dangerous. He sees no need for reconciliation, no value in restraint. He believes that justice can only be achieved through force, that peace is weakness, and that strength lies in dominance. And so he fights, he destroys, and he loses himself in the very fury he once claimed to control. But anger does not only destroy others, it destroys the man himself. It eats away at his spirit, poisoning his mind and hardening his heart. It separates him from those who love him, from the wisdom that could guide him, and from the grace that could heal him. And in that isolation, the devil rejoices, for he knows that a man consumed by anger is a man who has already begun to lose the battle within himself. Greed is a hunger that cannot be satisfied. It is not merely the desire for wealth, but the relentless pursuit of more money, more power, more possessions, more influence. And it is precisely this insatiable hunger that the devil finds so enticing in men. For greed is not a sin of excess alone, it is a sin of distortion. It convinces men that material wealth equates to worth, that success is measured by accumulation, and that happiness can be bought. But in reality, greed does not enrich, it impoverishes. It takes what is sufficient and makes it insufficient, turning abundance into scarcity and contentment into dissatisfaction. Let us consider the man who has built a fortune yet finds himself perpetually discontent. He has more than he needs, yet he is never satisfied. He looks at those with greater wealth and feels envy at those with less and feels superiority. He believes that with just a little more, just one more promotion, one more investment, one more acquisition, he will finally be at peace. But peace never comes, for greed is a bottomless pit and no amount of riches can fill it. The devil knows this, and he delights in watching men chase an illusion that will forever elude them. History is filled with men who were consumed by greed, and their stories serve as warnings. Consider the biblical account of King Nebuchadnezzar, a ruler of immense power and prosperity. His kingdom flourished, his wealth was unparalleled, yet he fell into the sin of pride and greed, believing himself to be greater than the heavens. In response, God stripped him of his sanity, reducing him to a beast-like existence until he recognized that true power does not belong to men, but to the divine. His descent into madness was not a punishment alone. It was a revelation, a reminder that no amount of gold or glory can substitute for humility and wisdom. And yet, men continue to fall into the same trap. We see it in the corporate executive who exploits workers for greater profit, in the politician who bends laws to increase his influence, and the businessman who sees people not as individuals, but as means to an end. Greed blinds men to the suffering of others, convincing them that their own advancement is the only thing that matters, and in that blindness they become instruments of injustice, perpetuating systems that favor the wealthy while leaving the poor to struggle. But greed does not only corrupt the powerful, it infects men from all walks of life. It is the man who spends beyond his means to keep up appearances, the man who steals from his employer for personal gain, the man who sacrifices his relationships for career advancement. It is the quiet voice that whispers that enough is never enough, that there is always something more to be had, something better to be acquired. And in listening to that voice, men lose sight of what truly matters: integrity, love, purpose. The devil does not need to force men into greed. He only needs to let them believe that happiness lies in possession. And so men chase after wealth only to find themselves more empty than before. They trade peace for prosperity, virtue for visibility, and in doing so they become prisoners of their own desires. For greed does not bring freedom, it brings bondage, chaining men to a cycle of endless pursuit with no fulfillment in sight. And in that bondage, the devil rejoices, knowing that a man who worships money has already placed himself under the rule of something far darker. Sloth is often misunderstood. It is not merely laziness, nor is it simply the desire to rest. No, sloth is a far more insidious vice. It is the refusal to act, the deliberate avoidance of responsibility, and the surrender to apathy. It is the man who wastes his potential, who watches opportunities slip away while convincing himself that there will always be tomorrow. The devil loves sloth because it keeps men from fulfilling their purpose, from growing in virtue, and from striving toward the greatness they were created to achieve. While pride blinds men to their flaws and greed distorts their values, sloth paralyzes them entirely, leaving them trapped in a cycle of inaction that erodes both spirit and soul. Let me give you an example. Consider the man who once had dreams. Dreams of success, of service, of making a difference in the world. He had talent, intelligence, and the means to accomplish great things. But over time, he let those dreams slip away. He told himself he would start tomorrow, that he needed more time to prepare, that he was simply waiting for the perfect moment. And so, year after year, he remained stagnant, watching as others passed him by. He became comfortable in mediocrity, convincing himself that he was content, when in truth, he was simply afraid to try. The devil delights in such men, for they are men who have given up on themselves. Sloth does not only manifest in the failure to achieve worldly success, it also manifests in the neglect of spiritual growth. It is the man who knows he should pray, but convinces himself that he is too busy. It is the man who understands the importance of virtue, but chooses to remain unchanged. It is the man who hears the call to be better, to do more, and to give of himself, yet responds with indifference. Sloth is not rebellion, it is surrender. It is a refusal to fight, the abandonment of effort, and the acceptance of a life that falls far short of what could have been. Consider King Solomon, one of the wisest men who ever lived. He was given great wisdom, great wealth, and great power, yet in the end he grew. He stopped seeking God, stopped striving for righteousness, and allowed his heart to be led astray by foreign influences. His sloth in spiritual discipline led to the division of his kingdom, the loss of his legacy, and the suffering of his people. And yet, how often do we see this same pattern repeated in modern men? The man who once sought to live with integrity but now settles for convenience. The man who once desired to be a leader but now avoids responsibility. The man who once had faith but now barely remembers how to pray. The consequences of sloth are not always dramatic, but they are profound. A man who does not pursue his purpose will find himself filled with regret. A man who does not cultivate his virtues will find himself hollow. A man who does not act on his convictions will find himself powerless. And in that emptiness, the devil rejoices, for he knows that a man who does nothing is a man who has already lost the battle within himself. The devil does not always come with fire and fury. He often arrives in silence, with a whisper, with a clever suggestion that sounds reasonable, even wise. Deception is one of his most potent weapons, and men in their arrogance and self-reliance are particularly vulnerable to it. The devil does not need to force men into sin. He merely needs to convince them that their choices are justified, that their actions are harmless, that their deviations from truth are for the greater good. He does not present himself as evil. He presents himself as a friend, offering shortcuts, justifications, and alternatives that seem appealing until they lead men astray. Consider the man who tells himself that a small lie is not truly a lie. He convinces himself that withholding the truth is not deception, that bending facts is not dishonesty. He tells himself that he is protecting someone, that he is sparing feelings, that he is avoiding unnecessary conflict. And yet each time he does this, he weakens his own moral compass. He begins to believe that deception is not only acceptable but necessary. He starts to see honesty as a burden, as something that hinders progress. And in doing so, he opens the door for greater and greater compromises. The devil does not need to deceive a man outright. He only needs to make him comfortable with deception. We see this in history and the downfall of leaders who convinced themselves that their actions were justified. Take, for example, the betrayal of Judas Iscariot. He did not set out to betray Jesus with malicious intent. He told himself that his actions would force Jesus to reveal his true power, that he was merely hastening the inevitable. He convinced himself that he was playing a role in a greater plan, that he was not truly doing wrong, and yet his deception led to tragedy, not only for Jesus, but for himself. When he realized what he had done, he was overcome with regret, but it was too late. The devil had already won, for he had made Judas believe that his betrayal was something other than what it was. Deception does not only manifest in grand betrayals. It manifests in the small, everyday choices men make. It is the man who tells himself that cheating is acceptable if no one will find out. It is the man who justifies dishonesty in business because everyone does it. It is the man who tells himself that he is not truly hurting anyone, that his actions are not that bad, that he is only trying to survive. And in each of these moments, he distances himself further from truth, from integrity, from the person he was meant to be. What makes deception so dangerous is that it corrodes trust, not only in others, but in oneself. A man who deceives others begins to doubt his own words, his own motives, his own sense of right and wrong. He becomes lost in a web of falsehoods, unable to distinguish truth from illusion. And in that confusion, he becomes vulnerable to the devil's greatest trick, that of convincing men that they are still in control, that they are still good, that they have not gone too far. But the truth remains, deception once embraced leads only to darkness. So my brothers, we have examined the 7 things the devil loves about men: pride, lust, anger, greed, sloth, and deception. These are not merely abstract concepts. They are real, tangible forces that shape our lives, our choices, and our destinies. The devil does not announce his presence with thunder and lightning. He does not demand our souls with overt threats. No, he is far more cunning than that. He whispers, he tempts, he disguises his influence as wisdom, as freedom, as progress. He does not need to force us into sin. He only needs to convince us that our choices are harmless, that our indulgences are justified, that our failures are not our fault. And in that deception, we lose ourselves. But here is the truth. We are not powerless. We were not created to be slaves to vice, nor were we destined to be victims of the devil's schemes. We were created for something greater. We were created for virtue, for purpose, for holiness. And though the devil may love the weaknesses within us, we do not have to give him the satisfaction of seeing us succumb to them. We can resist, we can fight, we can rise above the temptations that seek to define us. This is not a battle that can be won overnight. It is a daily struggle, a lifelong commitment. It requires humility to acknowledge our flaws, courage to confront them, and perseverance to overcome them. It demands that we examine ourselves, that we hold ourselves accountable, that we seek guidance when we falter. It calls for us to be vigilant, to recognize the devil's tactics before they take root in our hearts. For the devil thrives in secrecy, in complacency, in the belief that we are beyond temptation. But when we shine the light of truth upon our lives, when we stand firm in our convictions, when we refuse to be deceived, we strip the devil of his power. Let me be clear, this is not a solitary fight. We do not have to wage this battle alone. We have each other. We have the wisdom of those who have come before us. We have the strength of community, the guidance of faith, the grace of God. And in that unity, we find our greatest defense. For when men stand together in virtue, when they hold one another to a higher standard, when they refuse to be swayed by the temptations that seek to divide them, they become an unshakable force. They become men of integrity, of courage, of purpose. So I leave you with this challenge. Do not allow the devil to claim victory in your life. Do not give him the satisfaction of watching you fall. Stand firm, be vigilant. Recognize his schemes, reject his lies, and embrace the path of righteousness. For though the devil may love the weaknesses in men, we do not have to give him the pleasure of seeing us defeated. We were made for more. We were made for strength. We were made for truth. And in that truth, we find our freedom.